Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice. Recently, as we all know, immense strain has been placed on our legal system. A lawless executive has rapidly subverted many constitutional norms and laws and standards. Hundreds of lawsuits have been filed against the Trump administration, and so many judges, including those appointed by Donald Trump, have largely stood strong against many of these illegal acts. Now, a lot of these cases are going to be decided in coming weeks and months by the Supreme Court, but it all reminds us how important it is to have a legal system and a sense of the Constitution that stands strong. And to that end, today I'm really delighted to be joined by Gregg Nunziata. Gregg is the executive director of the Society for the Rule of Law. It's a leading group of conservative lawyers and jurists who are working to protect the Constitution. He was a senior lawyer in the Senate for Senators John Thune, now the majority leader, and Marco Rubio, and a longstanding, articulate voice among legal conservatives who's fighting now, very gutsily, I think, for the rule of law. We're going to talk about how the legal field is doing and standing up for the rule of law, and how lawyers, especially conservative lawyers in the conservative legal movement, can make the case for liberal democracy going forward. Gregg, welcome, and it's been such a pleasure to work with you and your colleagues over these months in this intense moment. It would be really great if you could start by describing sort of where you came from and how you came to this point. What's your path into conservative legal advocacy and the conservative movement?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be back in New York and to be at the Brennan Center, and good to talk to you about all of this. So, I was born here in New York in a law enforcement family in Queens, and I grew up kind of coming from maybe a Nixon/Reagan Republican or former Democrat background, right? And went off, had in my room in high school, I had a poster of Reagan, and I was always interested in conservative ideas and conservative politics. I went off to college and law school and got involved in student efforts along those lines, but also studied. I was really taken with kind of conservative political theory with Edmund Burke and Russell Kirk and all these guys, and spent a lot of time reading those ideas in college. Went on into law school, thinking a little bit about maybe playing some role in that world, but I didn't have fully formed plans for any of this. I started as a lawyer at a big law firm in Philadelphia on the day that September 11th happened, and so we were having our first day of training in a big conference room on the top floor of what is a tall skyscraper for Philadelphia, not so tall for New York, and saw those shocking images, and I was on the phone with my grandfather, who was a retired cop here in Queens, and cousins who were on the job and down at the site, and felt like big things were happening in the world. And I don't want to demean people who practice law and make an honest living, but I felt like I was wasting my time billing hours, and I wanted to do something. Somebody's got to do that. But I wanted to be part of something, I guess, bigger. And I had friends at the time in the White House, at the Justice Department, in Congress, from law school in particular, who kind of showed me that there were other paths in law than the law firm. So I kind of, I think September 12th, decided I wanted to find a way to get here, get to D.C. And it took me a while, but I finally came down to work in the Bush Justice Department, first under Alex Acosta, who would later be Trump's labor secretary. I spent a couple years at DOJ, and then I almost went back to the law firm when a former partner in my law firm by the name of Arlen Specter became chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And it was sort of a funny time, and this is going way back, but Senator Specter was a moderate Republican, what we might have called a liberal Republican, or a Rockefeller Republican, pro-choice Republican from the Northeast. And at the time, it was rather controversial that he was going to become chairman of the Judiciary Committee. People thought there might be vacancies on the Supreme Court. And if Specter was in charge, Specter, who had voted against Edmund Burke, if Specter was in charge.
He might have voted for Edmund Burke. But
he actually quizzed me on Edmund Burke in our job interview, which was, he asked me if I had read the speech to the electors of Bristol, which is when Burke tells his voters that they are sending essentially a delegate to Parliament, and they're entrusting him. They are voting for someone whose judgment they trust. He is not there to merely represent their views.
This is what John F. Kennedy drew on in the Profiles in Courage.
Yes. The
role of senators.
And so Specter loved that because he liked to be a contrarian. He liked to yell at his voters and tell them they were wrong. But conservatives were concerned that Specter's chairman, Specter, who had voted against the Bork nomination of the Supreme Court, which was a defining moment for legal conservatives, that maybe he couldn't be trusted if a vacancy happened under George W. Bush. So Specter made a bunch of commitments to secure his gavel. That he would recognize that as chairman, his role was to lead the Republicans on the committee, and that he would hire some staffers who were more from the right side of the party. So I was part of that effort. I had someone who had been steeped in kind of the conservative legal movement from the beginning. Was a member of the Federalist Society, and he hired me to work on judicial nominations. So I ran judicial nominations for the Senate Judiciary Committee Republicans for a while, worked on the Roberts and Alito nominations, on dozens of other nominations to the Justice Department, to lower courts, handled closely the Gorsuch and Kavanaugh nominations to the circuit courts. Later on, I worked for Senator Thune for the Republican Policy Committee, doing Judiciary and Homeland Security policy.
Who is now the majority leader.
Who's now the majority leader, and who I think really rather well of. It's not a job I would want, but particularly these days. But I do think highly of Senator Thune. And then I worked for Senator Rubio for 4 years, really during the second Obama term. So that included Senator Rubio's legislative efforts on the Hill, which were significant, and then his run for the presidency, which we unfortunately lost to somebody from this part of the world, from New York City.
Also from Queens.
Also from Queens, that's right. So after Trump won the presidency, I decided that it was time for me to take some time away from public service. I went back to the private practice of law. And thought I'd wait for this populist moment to pass, this era of politics that didn't quite fit me, and that era has not passed yet. And I have decided some years ago that I couldn't just stay on the sidelines. So late in the first Trump term, I started speaking out more on legal issues when I thought it was really important, kind of from a conservative institutionalist point of view, to speak on principle. And the first time I did that was in an episode that's a little bit lost to history now, I think, but Pat Cipollone, the White House counsel, sent a letter to Congress essentially saying that the Trump administration would no longer participate in routine congressional oversight. Now, my background is that, Article 1, Congress, I believe it's Article 1 for a reason. We have branches of government that are equal in dignity, but not equal really in power, I don't think. Congress is meant to be the driving force of our representative democracy. And that kind of that insulting letter was not seriously lawyered. The tone was really aggressive, really just offended me as kind of an institutionalist and a conservative and a constitutionalist. And it was actually a social media moment that really got me going in the current path. I read this letter. I had very few social media followers at the time, but I typed on Twitter, I wrote, "This letter is bananas. It's a barely lawyered middle finger to Congress. It's unacceptable." Then I went out for a jog and came home to find out that my tweet had gone viral. And the next morning it was a headline in the New York Times, "This letter is bananas," with quotes around it. And from then on, I guess I felt liberated to really speak out on things that I thought were important. And I think it continues to be really important that principled legal conservatives speak on these issues, and that institutions and the Constitution are more important than any policy agenda we have, more important than any political party. And that's what I've been trying to do for the better part of the last decade, including in my current role as executive director for the Society for the Rule of Law, where I've been for the last 2 or 3 years.
And your pedigree as a conservative, as a principled conservative, is undoubtedly part of why that landed as loudly as it did. What was it about the conservative legal movement that attracted you so much? It came after a period of many decades of kind of liberal dominance of the judiciary, and it was in some ways a reaction to it. But it spoke to you in some deep way pretty clearly because it's driven you in principled ways, to stand up for these things.
Yeah, I mean, I always came to politics from ideas before parties and before politicians. I mentioned Reagan on my wall. Reagan mattered a lot, but I also, if you would believe it, I subscribed to National Review as a 12-year-old. And
so you were Michael J. Fan.
I was. But he was too much of a partisan. So yeah, but I, and you remember like the particularly. So I was born in Queens. I largely grew up in Connecticut, and if you remember, there was this kind of William F. Buckley and National Review led fight against Weicker, a Republican in Connecticut, and for Joe Lieberman, the Democrat, believing that was the better path forward for conservatives. And I kind of always brought that mindset to politics. I mean, I care about the Republican Party. I still do, but I think it's ideas that are most important and principles that are most important. And I brought that through my education at Georgetown, at law school at Chicago, and then when I got into politics, it was these legal issues, constitutional issues that were most important to me. And I thought I found in a conservative legal movement a community that I thought was and was really motivated by ideas. And it coalesced in the 70s and early 80s around the idea at the time that the judiciary had kind of slipped its constitutional leash. And you and I may disagree on some of this, but to me that was obvious that whatever you think about abortion, that the Constitution didn't set abortion policy for this country. I mean, that is an issue that maybe supercharged the movement because there was legal principle overlaid with some moral and ideological concerns. But that was kind of down the line. I saw the court doing things that I'm kind of more sympathetic with. As I've gotten older, I've gotten much more concerned about capital punishment, but it seems quite clear to me that it's a constitutional remedy that our legislators can choose. And so this was very important to me. The structure of our government, that it's fundamentally a representative government. The voice of the people is important, but the law also has an important role, and that everything must be in its place. And so I saw a conservative legal movement that was motivated most by that. And not just along for the ride in politics. And maybe I should take a diversion here. I was really proud, personally, of the most painful, maybe, chapter in my career as a Republican conservative lawyer before the Trump era was the Harriet Miers nomination, which I think was a good moment for the conservative legal movement in that it objected. And it's hard for people to remember how attached Republicans and conservatives were to George W. Bush, the president, after 9/11, but they very much were. And it was kind of a remarkable moment that legal conservatives thought that Mrs. Miers, who has a lot of good things to be said about her, was the wrong person for this role, and that they did not just defer to the president, and that senators didn't just defer to the president. So I was part of that process, for 3 weeks where conservatives fought amongst each other over the future of the court. And I was kind of proud to be with those who were putting principle first as we saw it and not just partisan loyalty, even knowing it was weakening a president that we believed in and supported.
How much of that was really about social issues and about abortion? When she was withdrawn, Sam Alito was nominated in her stead. Was that about principle, or was that a sort of within the Republican coalition a kind of fight over substance?
It's hard to separate it out now because look, I mean, Roe versus Wade is everything. There's real legal reasons to object to it, and there are and have always been people who are supportive of liberal policies or permissive policies on reproductive issues who see constitutional problems with that decision, right? Even those who might find some right to privacy or some right to abortion in other places, like that was a flawed decision, I think, for lots of reasons. But of course, it's superpowered in politics by just the substance of the issue that's implicated, and I'm sure that was all there too. But the way the fight played out was really interesting. I think that the White House tried to defend the Miers nomination largely on the substance of abortion. They said, well, she goes to a really conservative church. Her pastor vouches for her. And to people like me who came from a principled legal background on this, that was just repellent. Like, no, that's what we've been saying for 20 years. It's not about her personal views. It's about what the Constitution says and whether she'll listen to that regardless of her personal views. So that was an important kind of moment for me and in my career. And again, whatever you think about the nomination or the principles there, it was extremely important to me that there were conservative lawyers who viewed their legal approach and their principles as coming first. And there's been a lot less of that lately. There's been a lot of people who call themselves conservative lawyers who seem to view it as their job to write permission slips for an executive that I think is way off the rails.
So let's fast forward to the Trump era, Trump's first term, Biden, and now this second Trump term. What was the reaction when you spoke out? And how much groupthink is there, or ideological or partisan loyalty and enforcement is there on the right at this moment when you question something like that?
It's not a question that's easy to answer because I think it depends on the question, it depends on the moment in time, and things have been. This term is very different from the first term in a lot of ways. So, I think in the first term, I think there was a broad understanding on the right that the president wasn't one of us, and that he was flawed in many respects, but that there was a hope that we can work productively with him. So a lot of the arguments that I had privately about the things I said publicly with my friends on the right weren't about the substance of anything I said. It was about the pragmatism of it all. I was like, well, of course you're right, but we're in a coalition with this guy. He's prickly. If you say that, it's
and on judges, he's really nominating, whether he believes it or not. He's nominating people the Federalist Society have recommended, and this is an opportunity for a transformation that we've wanted for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, like politics is. There's pragmatism to politics, and I think that a lot of principled conservatives from most of the Trump administration, the first one, could say that it was flawed, but on balance, we came out ahead. A lot of the things conservatives feared about him getting out of NATO, hurting our standing on the globe, sinking the economy with tariffs. There were so many things that conservatives feared that really didn't happen in the first administration. And fiscal conservatives got a tax cut bill they mostly liked. Legal conservatives got judges they mostly liked. And I feel like up until about the election, there was a good claim that conservatives got more than they lost out of the deal. I think once you had a president who was clearly not even before the election, clearly telegraphing that he would not accept a loss, we were in really dangerous constitutional territory, and nobody would speak out against it. And that is I think when I got into a deeper breach with some of my friends, I wrote an article in The Atlantic that November after Trump's first loss, and I wrote it, 2 or 3 days later, and the headline or the point of the article was that it was kind of urgent that elected Republicans, say out loud that Trump had lost, that this was really just saying it would be really important for moving the country forward and for kind of protecting the peaceful transfer of power, that humoring his obvious lies had great civic risk.
There were all these blind quotes saying, "Oh, let him spout off. He'll get over it. What could be the harm?" What could be the harm?
Yeah, no, I remember, and I've speculated about who some of those quotes belonged to over the years. But yeah, I thought it was really important that we say something. And I remember, the Atlantic does a lot of fact checking and the fastidious editing, and it took a couple weeks before my piece ran. And I remember every day thinking, I've got this great piece, and it's going to be irrelevant by the time they clear it, because surely in the next week, in the next 2 weeks,
meeting in the Oval Office, hand over the
like surely they're going to come out. Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy are going to come out and make a strong statement by the time this piece runs. And then of course that never happened. My piece I think came out around Thanksgiving, and Republicans were still humoring the president, and we saw where that led, which to me, again, was a real lesson about just how important it is to speak truth and to speak honestly and to uphold and to put your principles ahead of kind of short-term tactical thinking, which has real dangers.
And so the Society for the Rule of Law, which you are the executive director of, it's a really eminent group. Who are the members, and what are you aiming to do?
So the Society for the Rule of Law began with a forerunner organization, which kind of was a group of conservative lawyers, mostly Federalist Society members, early in the first Trump administration, who I think shared a concern that there was some creeping illiberalism on the right, and more broadly a concern that legal conservatives were being too coy about it. And if our principal mission was defending the institutions of this country and the Constitution, which I think it is. I mean, just again to level set, a conservative is not a Republican or a Trump enthusiast. A conservative, first among all things, is someone who wants to conserve. And what do we want to conserve? In America, it's liberal democracy. It's our Constitution, our separation of powers, our checks and balances, our free elections, these very basic things. And if we're willing to risk those things to win an election or to score a victory on taxes or abortion or gun rights or whatever it might be, we're losing the mission, to win the day. And so I think there was a shared concern amongst this original group, which included some former judges, former former lawyers in Republican White Houses, DOJ. Academics share this concern that the conservatives weren't speaking up enough. So they started having some events kind of around the sidelines of the Federal Society meetings and made some statements that were important in their individual capacity, would get involved in amicus briefs on important issues. From that nucleus was a more formal organization was founded late in the Biden administration, which is the Society for the Rule of Law, and I'm the first executive director. We are a bigger organization. We're a national membership organization, and our membership is more diverse than maybe the headliners might suggest. We have some big names sort of in our organization. Judge Ludig, retired conservative judge, who most of us in the legal right were disappointed did not get the Harriet Miers nomination
to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I know. I mean, he was like the top choice of many of us during the Bush administration. So he's a prominent member. He's on our board.
And he is known to many as the person who Vice President Pence consulted. Can I overthrow the election? And said, actually, I'm retired, but no, you can't.
Yeah. So several other big names from former administrations. Peter Keisler was former acting attorney general under George W. Bush, was nominee to the circuit courts, who was opposed by Democrats quite mistakenly, and several others. But we're broader than these handful of names from Washington. We have lawyers all around the country who describe themselves as, most of them describe themselves as conservatives or libertarians, but really believe that the defense of the Constitution, the rule of law, and American democracy come before any of these policy fights, and certainly come before a political party or a politician. But the range is broader than you might think. I hear, I wouldn't say this is the majority of our membership, but I hear from members who are 3-time Trump voters because they say, look, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't vote for Kamala Harris. I think all in all, the Republican's always better, or nearly always better. But gosh, I want some guardrails around this guy. And I want to be part of an organization that's going to draw lines. So I'm actually really always gratified to hear from those folks because I think that's important, and there should be more people in America who draw those lines. I try to say, whenever I'm speaking publicly, I try to emphasize this. Like, even if you think Donald Trump is the wisest and most virtuous leader we've ever been blessed with in this country, he is not going to be our president forever. And do you want to create an office with these kind of powers? I mean, just on simple things like emergency powers. I think this does connect with people who are much more who view the president much more favorably than I do. Would you want a Kamala Harris with emergency powers to declare a national gun emergency or a climate emergency, and what would that mean? How would you feel about that? And the answer is no.
Why, in the past anyway, and to some degree currently, we have worked with Rand Paul or with Mike Lee, who seems perhaps less enthusiastic about working across the lines at this precise moment. But there are a lot of principled conservatives on those kinds of issues who've actually spoken up. What kind of reaction have you gotten from people in the Federalist Society, from others on the legal right, and what kind of reaction from people sort of on the legal left? How has this been seen?
Yeah, the Federalist Society is, I think, is much more diverse than people think as well. It's. I always, we often say the Federalist Society is a them. It's not an it. I mean, there's a pretty broad membership. Each chapter, each law school student chapter, each lawyer's chapter is different. So there's a kind of a varied culture there. And I'm a member of the Federalist Society. A lot of our membership are members, so there's overlap, and I certainly don't see kind of a competition. I think we're trying to do different things.
How do they see?
Well, you have to ask them. You should have them on. But I do think that there's a fundamental difference between, say, the modal or the average member of the Society for the Rule of Law and the average member of the Federalist Society is that the average member of the Federalist Society has a deep faith in the resiliency of our institutions and may think that I'm a bit hysterical. And I think the average member of the Society for the Rule of Law thinks our institutions are fragile, vulnerable, and must be actively not just defended but strengthened with each generation. And that's just I think that's a fundamental cultural difference we have. And so I think I have that disagreement with a lot of my conservative lawyer friends. Like they agree generally or directionally with the point I make, but they think that I'm over concerned about the risks, that I'm blind to just, this is just politics, things come and go. And we have this disagreement. I mean, I feel pretty confident that I'm right to be worried. And I think, frankly, if I'm wrong in the right direction. I mean, I think conservatives of all people should understand that institutions need to be defended, that they can be pulled down, that they're much harder to build up than they are to destroy. And if we're going to make a mistake as conservatives, that mistake should be being overly concerned about the health of our institutions and the security of our freedoms.
Let's turn a little bit to some of the sort of substantive constitutional and institutional questions that we're all grappling with. You've written a lot about executive power. You've got a piece coming out any day now, if it hasn't come out by the time this airs already, in the Atlantic on executive power. And as you've said, it's in recent decades, it's often been conservatives who've been most enthusiastic about the strong executive. Some of this is a response to the constraints that were imposed on the executive after Watergate and Vietnam and that era. But there's been an enthusiasm for, as Terry Eastland wrote in his book, he was the Reagan Justice Department spokesperson, energy in the executive, quoting Alexander Hamilton. You've thought a bit more about this. I assume you still support a strong executive, but that some of the downsides are more visible to you.
Yeah, I think that conservatives have a really well-formed, or legal conservatives anyway, have a really well-formed, principled view of the role of the judiciary. I think our understanding of the role of the executive is less well-formed and less well-rooted in principle. I think that ultimately we need to be concerned that the structure of the Constitution works and that checks and balances work. And the judiciary works. It's strong. It's independent. Congress is not working. Everybody could see that. The executive is doing too much. And I think anybody really could see that. If you put yourself in the shoes of the founders and ask, how does this seem normal to you? I think the answer would be no. The founders
it might seem familiar to them.
Well, right. They want.
This is what they had the revolution.
Yeah.
Spurn.
No, they wanted to build an energetic, effective executive. They saw the need for that. But I think they were very mindful that they were not trying to recreate the kind of executive that they had divorced themselves from. So I think we want to make sure that checks and balances are properly calibrated. And the excessive strength of the presidency today is a huge problem. I think conservatives need to grapple with it. I think conservative jurisprudence, we talk about this court a lot, and there's some perceptions that the conservative majority on the Supreme Court are a bunch of Trump partisans. I think that's wrong. I really do. I could object to opinions here and there, but I think by and large, they're principled lawyers doing a principled job. I do think many of them are wrong on executive power. I do think that, I think it's principle for most of them, getting them in the wrong place. But that principle, I think, is really poorly rooted. I think that the conservative legal movement came to exist in the 70s and 80s. And I think its favoritism for executive power is largely an accident of history. I mean, this was a time when one, they thought the judiciary was the biggest constitutional threat in the era of coming at the tail end of the era of the really activist court. So they thought that was the biggest threat.
And the judiciary was the liberal branch.
It was the liberal branch,
and the conservatives sometimes had the executive.
Well, yeah. So they wanted to fix the court. They didn't pay attention enough to the Congress or the executive, but to the extent they did, Congress had been in the hands of Democrats essentially unbroken since the Great Depression. And there was, I think, a natural, you say sometimes in politics, where you stand has a lot to do with where you sit. I think conservatives have been sitting in the minority in Congress, and it must have seemed in 1980 that Congress was this just impossible prize. If Republicans, the Conservative Party, was ever in power, it was in the White House. So I think that naturally created a generation of conservative lawyers who were bound to be more sympathetic to executive power. Layer onto that the fact, as you alluded to, this was a historic moment a really unusual historic moment where it appeared that the presidency had been put back in a box. And so there was some reasonable concern that maybe we had excessively fettered the president. In that little narrow moment, I think in the sweep of history, it's impossible to believe that. But you could see how in 1978, during the Carter administration, after the failure of the Vietnam War, after Watergate, somebody could think, based on kind of a clear analysis of the situation, that we may have weakened the presidency too much. I think we are clearly not in that universe. And if you are concerned about checks and balances and effective checks and balances, as a conservative or as any kind of American, you need to address this unbound executive that we have today.
And the unitary executive theory, which is a theory, but the Constitution says the executive power is vested in the president. But you've talked about this as something that has some validity, but it is blown extraordinarily out of proportion by the people who are pushing the most extreme version of it. Is that a fair assessment of your views, or you? I've heard you talk about something Arlen Specter used to say.
Yeah. So yes. So I worked, as I mentioned before, for Senator Specter. Senator Specter began his career, kind of really came to notoriety in part from his role in the Warren Commission, which looked into the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and that was. The conclusion famously involved a single bullet, which had been called the single bullet theory, particularly by conspiracy theorists who laughed it off. And I found as a young lawyer, much to my mortification, that when you use the phrase in front of Senator Specter, single bullet theory, he immediately interjected to say single bullet conclusion. And sometimes I'm tempted to say that about the unitary executive, because of course we have a unitary executive. The founders did consider multi-member executives. That some states had that kind of system, and they didn't want that. They wanted one president. So we have a unitary executive, and that is really not in dispute. What's in dispute are what are the implications of that. And the first implication, which I largely accept, is simply that Congress and the courts cannot kind of divide that authority or intrude into the internal executive branch. The question is, what does that really mean? I think the most basic claim is that, which I accept, is that the president must be able to set the course and the policy for the executive. But then you've got a bunch of other questions. What does that mean for the president to actually control the executive? I think it obviously means that he can fire people. I think that probably means he can fire people like CTC commissioners. So I go along with the executive theory, this unitary executive theory, quite a ways, and I'm on the Trump administration's side conceptually in some of these cases.
Even in these independent agencies that were established by Congress to not be able to have their commissioners fired.
Yeah, for me, I do think they're on shaky ground. Now, I've got other conservative concerns. A president that I would like, frankly, wouldn't test this, right? Would live with that encroachment for just kind of small c conservative principles. I don't think it's a big functional obstacle. But if you're really pushing the law, which I think a conservative president shouldn't challenge the limits of his power just for sport or at every turn. So I would accept things. But yeah, I'm sympathetic to the claim.
This says there's no civil service,
right? Which I think is wrong.
That the law does not apply to the executive branch,
right? And I would say that's wrong, right? I mean, and this administration has claimed exactly that. I just think that's wrong. I think that there is no impermissible intrusion in executive power for Congress to set up these agencies as it does and to put some parameters around how they operate and to do things for the good of the operation of those agencies, like put in civil service protections, which we can have a debate about how strong or weak they should be, but I don't think those interfere with the president's ability to superintend the executive branch. So there's that. And then the other question is kind of more broadly is the scope of executive power. So to say that the president controls the executive branch is one thing, and then we have debates about what that control is, and the other is how broad the executive power is. And sometimes these conversations are dressed up in unitary executive language, but I don't think they necessarily are. You could have a unitary executive that's a more narrow executive. And the
emergencies that are endlessly claimed by this president are all on their own. They don't require a view on the unitary executive.
No.
And you've argued that they're way out of control.
Yeah, no, I think they're way out of control. I think there's a good there's a bunch of ways to attack this. I mean, I think there are real constitutional arguments which we haven't gotten to, the court hasn't gotten to, about how much Congress can give away to the president. We're so a lot of conservative lawyers who care about the unitary executive are concerned about Congress infringing into the executive. Well, we should need to be as concerned about Congress giving away their legislative power to a branch to which it does not belong and the Congress did not give it. So there's constitutional questions about whether these emergency delegations should be accepted at all. But to the extent they happen, Congress should not be doing it so often, and courts should not be interpreting them so broadly and permissively. I mean, we have a president who is invoking statutorily authorized emergency powers on clearly protectural bases, and I think courts should be second-guessing them. And there's a lot of, again, conservative lawyers who are imprinted with this historical fear of impermissibly burdening the executive, that they don't want courts to look at the president's decision that an emergency exists. I think that's just wrong. I think that this has come up for instance, in the Alien Enemies Act litigation, which these are enhanced presidential powers to remove unauthorized foreign individuals from our shores that come into action based on an invasion. And the president has said that we are being invaded by Venezuela, and so therefore he has these powers. This is clearly not true. But you had a dissent, I think it was in the Ninth Circuit recently, where a conservative judge said, it is not the business of the courts to question the president on whether an invasion is happening. And that just strikes me as ridiculous. I mean, you could look out the window here and see that Venezuelan troops are not marching down the street, and a court should be able to say that. I mean, we should not have a court refusing to look at that. It's not a court respecting the integrity of the executive branch. It's a court just refusing to do its job, in my mind.
I want to go back to the role of the courts in a way. And you mentioned Edmund Burke, who above all else believed in moving slowly and respecting tradition. And, the creation of these independent agencies over 125 years of history is sort of how we've built up our government. Why is it the right role for the courts now to step in and say, actually, the branches need to go back in their boxes, everybody else got it wrong, and we're going to say this is the right way that the balance among the branches ought to be functioning?
I think there's a real, true tension that I've had trouble resolving between kind of traditional conservatism, Burkian conservatism, and legal conservatism. Legal conservatism.
More originalism.
Yeah, I mean, legal conservatism. I think starting the cleavage here is that Burke was operating in a system without a written constitution. We have a written constitution, and the founders wanted a written constitution for a reason. So I think most legal conservatives would say, and I'm sympathetic with this, is that the Constitution has to always come first. That if courts got things wrong and legislatures got things wrong, or if we were just constitutionally lazy for a century, that doesn't stop the law from being the law, and we have to take it seriously. And I largely believe that. I recognize that's in real tension with this kind of conservative value of don't disrupt things because there are unintended consequences, because if there's reliance interests, usually if things endure, there's a good reason. So there's tension there. I think the best way I could resolve it is that I think it's smart for a deliberate conservative legal majority to move slowly and to decide things narrowly when they can. It's unfortunate that we also have a president who's so grasping. I think a president who had more prudence about how he approached his powers wouldn't be testing these things and wouldn't be putting the court in a position to have to choose between those two values.
Well, the tariff case is an example. We, as you know, we were involved in that. I believe you may have been as well in front of the court briefs. There are plenty of ways for presidents to impose tariffs legally.
Yeah.
He chose to do it illegally to prove that he could, in effect, and put the Supreme Court in the position where they had to rule, as they did, that this was an illegal usurpation of power and an illegal use of the emergency powers. And this happens over and over again. So much of what he's doing in this term seems like an effort to expand the presidency for its own sake. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
And in a way, even for people who were comfortable with the first term, a breach in the constitutional order, very different from what we've seen before. And it's an interesting these cases, as you know, a lot of the impetus behind them came from the legal conservative movement. The New Civil Liberties Alliance brought one of these cases that we filed an amicus brief in. I always say that Leonard Leo is I guess, a new name for a holiday card list, at the Brennan Center. But this is something where people standing up for the rule of law have found common ground. I want to ask you quickly about the Supreme Court and then talk a bit about political strategy on all this going forward. We've talked a lot about the court over the months, and we probably have some disagreements about the court and its current status in our system and how it's doing. You've said that you think that the Supreme Court really is actually doing pretty well, yet its public trust in all the polls in the court is at the lowest level ever recorded. Is that something you worry about? And how do you see what do you think the right thing to do is about the Supreme Court?
I worry about the public perception of the court a great deal. I mean, the court has this incredibly important role. I don't think I could overstate the importance of our independent judiciary that the Supreme Court sits at the apex of. I talked about checks and balances and separation of powers. These ideas come to the founders from Montesquieu, who thought it was important to separate the legislative, executive, and judiciary, but said the one power that must be independent is the judiciary. You can live with some mixing and melding between executive and legislative power in a state, but without an independent judiciary, you cannot have liberty. I believe that's very true. I think we're seeing it today, and I think we should be grateful for a judiciary with all its flaws that you and I might disagree on what the flaws are, but we're pretty well blessed, I think, by a strong and independent judiciary that's staffed with courageous people who've not been intimidated by this president or by physical threats to their safety. It's really, I think, a credit to the judiciary. Americans should be proud of it. So these declining approval ratings, which not as low as the ratings for Congress or many other institutions, that so relatively we are in an age of collapsing faith in institutions. Relatively, the courts do a bit better than most, but it's a problem because the court does not have a military or a police force. The court's orders stand, or their decisions, all courts, their decisions have power because we, the people, give them legitimacy, because we believe in the law, and we believe in the legitimacy of the judges and justices who say what the law is. I think that there's been just terrible terribly irresponsible or deliberately destructive rhetoric from politicians that has made this all worse. And I'll say before I get to this administration, which is taking things to a new level, I think the rhetoric around, we talked about Roe versus Wade and Alito, the rhetoric around Dobbs from leading Democrats was awful, both before the decision, which seemed like to threaten the court, and after the decision, which one senator said the court has lost all legitimacy. It's taken a match and set a fire to any legitimacy it's had left. I mean, I think that's absurd. I mean, this was a contested area of constitutional law. And I think you can disagree with Dobbs, but again, this was not.
People yell about the Supreme Court all the time, though, right?
Yeah, that's right. But I do think politicians, particularly in national office, have a duty to have some kind of forbearance, and now especially the president. And this is where things get worse. This administration, we didn't see George W. Bush talking about the court this way when he lost cases in interrogation and detention matters after 9/11. We didn't see Biden or Obama talking about the court this way when the court ruled against some of their excessive attempts at executive power. The president, his vice president, his deputy chief of staff routinely called the courts, all judges, illegitimate, communists, tyrants, unelected, rogue. I mean, this is awful, for the future of our country. There's help. There's not help wanted. There are wanted posters, old Western style wanted posters for judges who ruled against the president in the halls of Congress today, for Republicans in the House that want to impeach these judges.
When you walk down the hallway of the Rayburn House office building, you see these on the doors.
Yeah, wanted, and not dead or alive, wanted for impeachment, but you get the message. I mean, it's a really, really unhealthy place to be as a country. So I'm worried about all of this, and I think anything we could do to improve the standing of the courts, the Supreme Court itself, and all the courts, federal courts, we should work on together. We at the Society for the Rule of Law are co-sponsoring a conference later this week at the University of Washington in Seattle about the independence of the judiciary. It's a matter that I come to a lot, and we work on this in both kind of public education and in amicus briefs. I mean, it's an extremely important challenge we face today.
Let's talk about how we get out of this mess. So much of what you've described really draws on your own credibility, in a sense, as a Republican, as a conservative, not as a rhino, not as a squish. What do you say to other conservatives, to other Republicans, either quietly or out loud at this moment, about what comes next? I mean, what are they really thinking about Trump, about the Constitution, and is there something they're going to come back to, or is this a permanent shift in how they see all these things?
There are different camps on the right now, and look, I think there is a real, and there are different conversations with rank and file voters and with kind of elites in Washington and New York. I think something that's changed since the first term. I mentioned before, these terms feel very different in a bunch of ways. Something that has changed is there's a real constituency for Trump-style politics on the right in the Republican Party, amongst some conservative intellectuals. I don't think I have much purchase with those people, and they're a relatively new force. In the first term they really weren't there. They're here now. So with those folks, I mean, I spend my time trying to debate them. I go to law school campuses, often have kind of debates sponsored by groups like the Federalist Society, where I make the case for liberal democracy and why conservatives should value liberal democracy. I think it's the first job, as I said before, for conservatives to preserve liberal democracy. So that's a debate. I think I'm just right. I think authoritarianism, or whatever you want to call it, strongman government, is always bad. I think it failed in Hungary, but if you think it failed in Poland, if you think that vision of politics can work, the only place it might work is in a small, uniformly Catholic, uniformly ethnic country in Europe. It's not going to work in a diverse country like ours. So, I mean, I just think I have got the better part of that argument, and I hope the future of the right is a future that values liberal democracy and pluralism, which is the conservative politics that I grew up in and that I know. I think we're still the majority, but a lot of the majority has been willing to go along with this moment, thinking that it's better than whatever the left has to offer. I think most of us, the majority of Republicans and conservatives, don't want this to be the forever future of the party. We had different views about whether there were pragmatic arrangements to be made with this administration. I think just the logic of that alliance is showing its limits. In the first Trump term, again, I think a lot of conservatives could have thought they got the better out of that term. Show me where they're getting the better here. I think social conservatives aren't thrilled that Robert F. Kennedy is at HHS. Economic conservatives are seeing tariffs wreck the world. Foreign policy conservatives are seeing Trump threatening to rupture NATO. I mean, there's just like down the line. I mean, conservatives used to say in the first Trump term, so much of the rhetoric is terrible, but we're getting some good policy. I don't think they could even say that anymore. So I think there's a time now. I feel that in my job at the Society for the Rule of Law, and just as a citizen, that I'm in two fights, and one is for the Constitution. One is a fight with allies across the country for our liberal democracy, that for the framework in which we can all disagree, so that next time I come back here, we can just argue rather than talk about the things we value together. So that's one fight, and I think the other fight is the future of the right, and I think that fight is much more open than people believe. It's that we have this just fatalism in politics. People forget that not that long ago, every smart person in Washington and New York and throughout the media said, there's no way Trump can win the nomination. There's no way. Like, everything he's talking about, that's not what the party believes in. And he won, and the party started to change. It can change back. And I think there are a lot of people out there who wanted to change back. So I'm trying to give those people hope, too.
We're having this conversation a few days after the election in Hungary. And you've gone actually to Central Eastern Europe a bunch, where they've faced a lot of the same retrenchment, illiberal democracy, as Orban called it. What lessons can we all learn from what has just happened in Hungary? And are they translatable in any way to this big, diverse country?
Well, two things. One, I wish I could take more Americans to Central and Eastern Europe. And there's probably other places in the world and Latin America that have similar stories. But in Central and Eastern Europe, the average person simply understands that threats to liberal democracy could come from the right or the left. It's particularly people who are a bit older, grew up under communism, or their parents grew up under communism. They have heroes who fought for freedom against left-wing authoritarians. And now they're seeing rising authoritarianism in the right. And you can hear that people are still alive today who won those nonviolent revolutions.
Like Valesa, as we were discussing, is out there giving speeches.
Out there giving speeches. There's this famous, and we need to design something like this for ourselves. The protest shirt in Poland had the word Constitution on it. And in Polish, the word Constitution includes the word you and me. So those words would kind of bold it out. And Lech Walesa wears it everywhere. But he can say, and so many others of that generation can say, so many of these things we're seeing today coming from the right once came from the communists. That freedom is kind of cross-ideological, and liberal democracy is cross-ideological, and that's the fight we could all be in together. So I would love people to get that lesson here, because I think we both frame it. People on the left just see this right-wing threat and have trouble broadening it to see that it doesn't have an ideological vector or doesn't necessarily have one. And people on the right retreat into kind of this team sport thing where they don't want to hear about the threat because it's on their side and they're in an alliance with them, and maybe they're used to thinking the other side overstates things or opposed to them.
The anti-Trump is more compelling than
for sure. So just having this just basic understanding of historic truth, that freedom is a cross-ideological value, and that strong men can arise anywhere on the ideological spectrum is just an important lesson we can all learn from them. And the second thing is, both in Poland and in Hungary, we've seen cross-ideological coalitions that have found a way to push back illiberalism and defend their country's values, their country's freedoms, and their fragile democracies by working together on those things, by being able to see the things they had in common and to fight for them without dropping the disagreements, right? I mean, there's
without this just moderation as the midpoint between.
I think this is a really important lesson, actually, for the democracy movement in America. We call it, if you want to call it the democracy movement. The people who are concerned about challenging rising illiberalism here, I think, spend way too much time talking about the problem of polarization and how we need to rebuild a political center. I don't want to dismiss that, because there's good in it, and having a political center facilitates compromise and negotiation, but that should not be our goal. I don't think we need to be telling people who have passionately held ideals, values that are really strong on the left and the right, that the only way forward for you in America is to give those up and be part of some corporate, mushy, centrist consensus.
Use your indoor voice.
Yeah, right. You don't have to. You don't have to give everything up. You can believe passionately on a left-wing position or a right-wing position. Just commit to being part of this American project together. Our Constitution is a framework that allows for these deep disagreements. Federalism helps it further. Blue states and red states can go different ways. So having seen that, look, Europe's very different. Parliamentary systems are different. There's a lot of ways that the lessons can't be carried over. But the reality of their politics is they saw they can push back on threats to liberal democracy by understanding shared values are more important than even deeply held policy differences. And so, I hope we can do some of that here too. I'm trying to do that all the time. It's why I enjoy working with folks at the Brennan Center and other places who may disagree with me on abortion or tax rates or the proper role of America in the world.
Let's get to the point where we can vigorously disagree on those things while not worrying quite as much about the Constitution, the rule of law, and our basic system.
That's the goal.
That would be the goal. Anyway, Gregg Nunziata, thank you for what you do. Thank you for your leadership. And thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. It was fun. It was an honor.
That was a tremendously inspiring in many ways and certainly interesting conversation about what it will take to really restore respect across ideological lines for the rule of law. I want to just add one additional thing that we discussed a little bit, which is what's gone on this past week in Hungary. As you know, Viktor Orban, the leader of that country for 16 years, was defeated roundly in a landslide by the voters in that country. And he has been a very strong articulator of what he calls illiberal democracy, the retrenchment of the rule of law. And he's done things that will be all too familiar in this country, installing allies to run media organizations, subverting the judiciary, subverting election processes, gerrymandering wildly, and many, many other things. And as we know, Vice President J.D. Vance actually went there to campaign in that country's election for this anti-democratic leader and party. It was really quite striking. And yet, despite all the institutional advantages that Orban and his cronies built into their system, the voters spoke out. What is there to learn from this? What can we in the United States learn from Poland, from Hungary, from these other places where these same issues have been addressed? And we see these issues, by the way, all over the world, in Turkey, in Israel, in India, in all these countries where longstanding democratic institutions have come under tremendous threat in recent years. One thing is that the coalition was broad. The person who won the office actually broke away from Orban's party. He was a person of the right. He was somebody who people from the center and the left and the principled right were able to unite around, and they put aside a lot of their differences on all kinds of other issues. That's a lesson I think that is important for people in our country as we grapple with the Constitution and how to uphold it, have to remember. That's a lot harder when you get actually political fights going on, when campaigns start, when there's the understandable polarization that happens. That's one of the things. Another thing is to understand that the institutions of government there had certain constraints that made it possible even to overcome Orban's built-in and stolen advantages. In Europe, a lot of people say that it was the backstop of the European Union, of the fact that they really cared in Hungary about their economic standing with the rest of Europe, as a way to help make sure that in the end he actually conceded defeat. Imagine that. Here in our country, we don't have the European Union. What are the institutional bases that can help us uphold democracy here and the Constitution here? Thinking about it, our federal system is one of the answers. The elections we run are run by states, as we hear all the time now with debates over these matters in Congress and in the courts. States run elections, and it's a lot harder to rig the elections in 50 states than it would be if it were all in the hands of one executive or one person. So we in the United States should learn a lot as best we can from the success in Hungary, from what's gone on in places like Poland, and understand that, during the Cold War, it took a while, but people understood there was an ideological dimension to these great power fights. Here, you've got an illiberal international. You had Putin and Trump and Vance both all backing Orban. I think those of us who care about democracy, freedom, liberalism in its traditional sense, and the rule of law have a lot to learn from people around the world and a lot to learn from each other. Gregg Nunziata, I think, is so compelling because he is not a moderate. He is not a centrist. We disagree, I'm sure, on so many issues, whether abortion rights, tax rates, anything else. That actually gives great power to his and his colleagues standing up for the rule of law. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to do the same when our own principles are called on, even under political stress. A lot to think about, but an encouraging moment in this great fight. Thanks so much for being part of it. Thank you for watching and listening. You can subscribe to this podcast on all the platforms that one gets podcasts on. Please give us a 5-star rating if that's a possibility. And above all else, please tell your friends and colleagues about it. Thanks so very much.